Thank you for listening to Paper Girl Podcast, a podcast for creatives, writers, and everybody involved in the book community in Tulsa. My name is Melodie Coulter. I am the host. I am also the co-owner of Meadow Market Books and More in Tulsa. And today I am joined by Erin Turner, who's a sculptor, a painter, an installation artist, and a newly published author of the book TOTEM, which is a collection of both essays and transcripts from panels and lectures done surrounding the Totem Park by Ed Galloway in Foyle, Oklahoma. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you for having me.
Cute.
Such a pleasure.
So this is the big release week. What have you been up to this week?
So we released the book on May 30th, kind of as a counter event to a lot of the, big Route 66 celebrations, in maybe a little bit of an attempt to create, a dialogue about acknowledgement of alternative histories that are maybe not as celebrated or spoken about or available in general. So we opened at the Center for Public Secrets with an exhibition that was a group show. There were a series of public installations, art installations. There's a billboard that's up right now at 6th and Quincy. There were a few wheat pasted installations, and we have now transferred that exhibition to Pursuit Films, which is right behind Circle Cinema.
Yeah.
And that exhibition will be up through the 1st of August. So it's kind of like the Center for Public Secrets is a beautiful space, but it's a little small. And so this was an opportunity to expand the show. So yeah, that's what I've been up to in the last couple of weeks.
I love that. Totem is an interesting read for me, revisiting it today after we just did a book club for the store. We do a living room book club, and I had everybody read Blackbirds in the Sky, which is a YA collection of history proceeding, documenting, and then everything that succeeded the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so reading that and then having this discussion about untold histories and very limited history and alternative histories in one part of Tulsa's fabric, and then coming into Totem was just really interesting to have two perspectives of Tulsa history in this time period. And I don't know, I appreciated it. And so I'm really excited to dig in to all of it. Can you kind of maybe explain to listeners who aren't familiar with the Totem Park a little bit about the park itself, and then how you got involved in the restoration project?
Yeah. So the exhibition itself, I think, is essentially a way of pulling these ideas that were in public space to the contemporary. So I want to start with that because I'm going to kind of go back and forth between what's happening now and then the Totem Pole Park. Because I really wanted to make that happen in the book, is this bridge between two different time periods and two different worlds and two different ways of kind of thinking about place. And, I think I may be jumping ahead, but just this idea of public space is a really kind of key factor into how I consider the work that I do and the park itself and where that situates itself. Because Ed Galloway, who is the man who created this park, was a maker. He was a sculptor, and he made a bunch of things throughout his entire life. And he was born in Missouri and then moved to Oklahoma. Moved to Oklahoma in the very beginning, of the 1900s. So he was like still Indian Territory, Oklahoma. And the I think his evolution, and that's something that I've thought about a lot, his evolution to create like a public sculpture park comes from, decades and decades of actually making and sculpting and being an educator. He worked at the Sand Springs home that Charles Page started. And so he was like an educator as well. And he was always a maker. And I think that's a really important aspect of the story, because as we kind of continue to think about the book and where it sits right now and like what that project was about, it's kind of like thinking about who he was as an artist and how to kind of utilize that essence and spirit of what he was doing in both his like professional life as an educator, as well as like in his retirement life, which was creating this totem pole park. Which he started building in like 1937. And essentially until he died in the early 60s. So he was constantly, the Totem Pole Park is a monument to the American Indian, as he's kind of stated what his impetus was for building the park and to like create a space where the first people of the land are celebrated. And so, like just reading that straight faced, you're like, oh, that's a nice intention. But really delving into what that means and looks like, especially at the time, when Native people didn't have the right to voice that for themselves, then you kind of like, okay, so what are we actually looking at? And, so I will take a step back and say that my experience with the Totem Pole Park has been from restoring the structures out there. And so I come from a maker's place first and foremost in my engagement with the park. And it was an incredible project to kind of like learn about, be made aware of like artist built environments as a genre and kind of understand like what that genre looks like throughout the world, but more specifically the United States, and kind of understand like what this impetus for making is for many people. And I think what's really incredible about these like rural kind of artist built environments is that it gives you like a sense of what was happening in rural America in these time periods where, especially in the arts, we celebrate those in the canon, not those in the field. And so his park is really cool because he's like walking with a wheelbarrow to the back of his property line where there is a creek and pulling up sand and then collecting all of the field stones and creating this, like this structure out of the Oklahoma landscape with neighbors dropping off baling wire and telephone wire to reinforce this, 90-foot structure in the middle of the country. And so I kind of see the park as, it was at the time, like maybe 10 years after Route 66 had kind of like been, initiated as
and only like a year or two after it had been like
fully paved.
Yeah.
And the park sits like 4 miles off of Route 66. And that is the majority of the travel that presently goes to the Totem Pole Park. So there's a part of the story that is very Route 66 based. And I kind of situate this place like less as a roadside attraction, more as a monument. Mm-hmm. And I say that because I do actually think that there was more of an impetus than just like pull people in to actually like engage in the arts.
Yeah.
He was an artist and he was like constantly kind of through like interviews saying things like, you have to like push your creativity. You have to like, like be inspired through whatever you can. And as an arts educator, I kind of see the park as like, oh, he like wanted to bring the public and families and, you know, people to be able to participate. He never charged for it. So it kind of like sits in this liminal space for me. And I don't take it as a straight, you know, roadside attraction, like come and give us $1 to see the whatever. But yeah, it's a really kind of interesting site. And over the years of working, it was kind of like, you know, they had, there was another book that was establishing who Ed Galloway was right when I started working on the restoration project that left me kind of with way more questions than answers. And I think that was one of the like reasons for wanting to initiate more research and context building, and really think critically about what the site is both in the public sphere then and now, and how it can continue to be like a site of, you know, education. Yeah. I think that's the biggest potential there. So that is what Ed Galloway's totem pole park is. And there are, I believe, 14 features. So it's not just the one totem pole. There's a gift shop that has a 12-sided room, that is a 12-sided room, or structure, I should say. And inside of that structure, there are like original murals that he painted. All of the structures outside, which include like fence posts and, you know, like an arrowhead and some other bird baths, a tree sculpture. There's like a lot of different features, but all of those have over the years been restored 2 different times. So I will be the second like large scale restoration that goes in to kind of like refinish. I shouldn't say refinish, but what we did was we took off all of the latex paint and replaced it with a silicate paint so that it lasts a lot longer and doesn't fade with the sun. It's like doesn't trap moisture, so it's better for the actual like substrate. So it was very much like a DIY project, and a lot of that reason is that these like artist built environments sit in this category that is just, well, what do we do with it? You know? And only, I would say like in the last, there's been, you know, a lot of research and like community around protecting these spaces. But in the last, I would say 4 years, there's been like, you know, an annual convening of stewards and conservationists who are engaged in artist-built environment sites in particular to share knowledge and share resources of how to restore and protect these kind of all very, I don't mean random in a derogatory sense, but they're sites that don't necessarily have material consistency. Yeah. And so there's a lot of questions around conservation and ethics of how to kind of like continue to preserve these sites into the future. And it is very much a labor of love. So I do also want to say that, you know, anybody who is involved in an artist built environment like the Totem Pole Park is, you know, spending a lot of sweat equity to keep this thing alive, because there is not like a funding body generally that is there to easily help. So yeah.
And how did you get involved in this particular project?
I was at a friend's studio who had old posters of the Totem Pole Park. Okay. And I had never thought about them prior to this one moment in his studio. I was like, oh, I don't know where those are. And he's like, really? They're an hour and a half away from here. You've never heard of this place? And so we went the next day, and when I was there at the gift shop, the woman kind of who was running the gift shop offhandedly said that they had been trying to find somebody to paint the totem for years. And I was like, well, I can do that.
Because you mentioned you talk a lot about coincidence,
Yeah.
especially in your opening essay, and about how you coincidentally got involved with this project, and now like it's all coming together. Like, oh, it really was a coincidence because you're from Tulsa, and yet this exhibit, this place has existed decades before you were born, and essentially just down the road. So definitely coincidence.
Yeah, and I find it funny that there's like very few people, at least before I started the restoration project, that knew about it in my world.
Yeah.
It's so close and it's so peculiar. The place is so peculiar, and that I am surprised that it's not like visited more by local people. I don't know why that is. We don't appreciate what's in our backyard,
We
or
really don't,
yeah.
because there are times where I mention places around Tulsa, and I'm not from Tulsa. I've been here 10 years. Like, oh yeah, we went on down to like even like Gilcrease, which is like a big name. Like, yeah, we went to Gilcrease. But like, what's that?
Hmm.
I'm like, how
Damn,
you don't even know about
that is really
this major
unfortunate.
Yeah. It's disappointing and strange. And so when people say like be a tourist in your own home, like, yes, you have got to think like a tourist and go check out, because there's this conversation that's had in, I think, the second panel.
Yeah, because Pablo Barrera references one of his associate curators and her like thesis project, which was based on like reading comments as a methodology for understanding space in the public. And they were like reading comments from the totem pole park and seeing those comments as like, oh, somebody's saying like, well, I mean, it's okay, but like, what a weird like Indian,
that's what it is. So
Indian site or whatever.
A lot of conversation about how people like they don't spend time in the actual indigenous communities when they come to Tulsa. Like somebody who's traveling Route 66 during the Centennial is like not seeking those spaces to actually learn. And so they end up at the Totem Pole Park thinking that this is like a representation of Native American art in Oklahoma, which is just like fully factually incorrect. But also an interesting piece of like how Oklahoma has engaged with Native populations throughout its entire history as a territory and a state. And so I think it's just like being a tourist in your own city is a way to like audit the message that we're sending to our visitors. Like, what are they seeing about Tulsa? Are they actually seeing Tulsa, or are they seeing like factually incorrect information, or are they just seeing like a very polished version? And in that polish, is that something that we want people to come away with thinking Tulsa is this way? And so, like, I don't know, it's key advice to think about with Tulsa and like make sure that we're aware of what people see. And I do love the concept, like there were conversations about like reading the reviews, but also kind of like being an insurgent in there and allowing that to be a space where you're providing more context and information. And I thought that was really cool, because as I read Totem, I'm like, well, but how do we explain to people? Because you can't have somebody just sitting out there all day saying, well, this is not how the indigenous people, like, there's not going to be any funding for that. You can't ask somebody to spend that time and labor day after day. And so.
But that's been signage and like, other kinds of ways of engaging, like, curriculum, or like, I think there are so many ways to do that. And I mean, very honestly, I think that that is one thing that, I mean, it would actually be so easy now with QR codes to go in and be able to access a lot of information without having somebody sitting there. And I do think that the read that has been done on this park in general has been very I think very focused on who Ed Gallery was as a person and as an artisan, less on what does the site mean,
Yeah.
and how do people take this site away with them, and how does that function in the present day, and how did it function in the past. And I think a lot of a lot of the like work that needs to be done is to really engage a population that is a tourist population. So it takes time, and it takes a lot of like commitment with the community and you know, the people engaging with the park from kind of a direct organizational standpoint. And it also takes time really thinking, you know, like who should be the voice behind that,
Yeah.
you know? And so I am hoping that the research presented in the book is a way of kind of opening up like, oh, there's a lot of information that can spill out. And one of the intents behind a lot of the like lectures that are transcribed in the book was an attempt to say, and what's missing and what would you do?
Yeah.
As a way of presenting like a guide, you know, a guidelines. Like, well, these are a bunch of scholars, these are a bunch of people who are very knowledgeable about a lot of different facets that kind of fit into this very strange story, and all of the convergences whose voice, you know, should be listened to in a lot of it. And thinking about what is missing from this conversation when you look at this park.
Yeah.
So that is the essentially the impetus of the entire project. Like, what is missing? What can we do? Whose voice should be there?
And I really enjoy the like there's a steady commentary throughout of reframing, approaching specifically the park as more of a discussion on art and less is this meant to be something very educational about Native cultures. And then like kind of juxtaposing that with monuments of you know other controversial moments. Like there's a lot of conversation about statues of Columbus and Confederate soldier statues, and um, like where in the conversation we have conversations about history and you know how this history is being presented person to person, artist to artist, and then you know in places where we can focus more on the artist and like the context for the impetus for building it. I think we can have a more grounded discussion about these works and their place in our society rather than screaming and ripping pieces down without having that moment of connection as a community. And so I found that thread really like interesting. What was that like specifically in writing that opening essay? Um, what was that journey like for you? Kind of taking it from project to, you know, documentation.
Yeah, I was really interested in one of the things that we did that is mentioned in the book, but essentially the book is a repository for a big public project. And that public project was a series of lectures, but it was also like some hands-on workshops at the park where it was a much more intimate group that engaged with artists or activists or politicians in a very direct, like, you know, intimate conversation about some of these questions. And one of the things that we did that I thought was really, you know, important, and I will kind of go back and say like this book I think is kind of both a methodology for placemaking, as well as like it's curatorial at its essence, but it's also it's also about thinking about how to critically engage in dialogue. And the thing that we did was everybody kind of, got a short article about a different monument and intricacies with that monument. And then, we like swapped it around and had a conversation about what was presented in that article. And there were anything from, it's a monument to Oñate in New Mexico, who is essentially the founder of the state of New Mexico, who was not celebrated at his time, but, massacred people and is now considered like the person who is on all of the monuments to the state of New Mexico as the founder. And so why and how did that happen at a time, especially when he was charged for all of his atrocities in real time, and
also honored,
and now honored. Like, why is he now honored, right? And so it's kind of that like rewriting and revisiting. And in my opinion, there's all of these kind of like controversial monuments. There are monuments to people who should not be monumentalized, in my opinion. But and I do think that, like having artists take the role of engaging in directing that conversation is really important, because there is a creative process of like understanding and translating that is embedded into the role of the artist. And so this idea of the intervention instead of like just erasure, in my opinion, is so much more powerful, because you're leaving space for somebody to think, oh, that was like, that happened. This monument like happened, and we put it up in public space. And why are we revisiting this? Oh, it's because of, like, what is the intervention that actually critically examines both who is being monumentalized, but why and when was it important to monumentalize that subject? And then how do you kind of like shift the conversation so that the public can see all of that and be able to have a more like complicated version of space, because space and place are extremely complicated. And I think like these very like, like linear reads of history is not real life. Yeah. It's like the easy way to go about thinking about time. But I think that it's so much more important to, complicate timelines. Yeah, and to like visualize convergences as well.
Yeah, that was something that we particularly loved about Blackbirds in the Sky, was that we had a huge conversation. Book club was yesterday, so like getting fresh in my mind about how when we teach history, and especially when we are required to learn history, we are just given essentially a timeline, and you might go a little bit into depth in pockets of the timeline, but you really don't receive a robust education in seeking different experiences of the timeline. You don't get a ton of like recontextualization. Like, I didn't learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre in high school. I didn't go to school in Oklahoma. And so all that I learned was in college and then in just adulthood. But even when students are taught about the Tulsa Race Massacre, they're given like, there was an altercation in an elevator and then Greenwood was gone. And it's kind of very like, but what was great about Blackbirds in the Sky was that it started off with conversations about like slavery in Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. And then it would visit like, the lynching of a white man a year prior to the race massacre. and then context of actual race riots that happened across the United States. And then would jump back and talk about like predominantly Black towns, and just providing all this information to view those days in Tulsa's history with a critical lens. How did we get here? This wasn't just things were kind of tense in Tulsa and then they boiled over. And so, like, there's so much importance in providing a full context and going back and revisiting the past, and then taking those chunks of history and applying them to the present and having those conversations, which is like particularly prescient to be having those conversations around the Centennial. And I know that like Reese Martin was at the second lecture, kind of talking like okay, yes, I hear what's going on. And I guess that kind of pulls me in a little bit of a shift in like how involved or aware of like the Route 66 Commission's like involvement in kind of correcting or intervening really in how Route 66 is presenting Native culture and these art pieces in general.
It's a great question, and I would be really intrigued to see where Reese is on that. I would say that, we had him at the Totem Pole Park to give one of our kind of conversations that was focused around the Route 66 component. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's important because in this project, the intent is not to single somebody out or one of the things out. It's to actually include and create those bridges between a lot of different parts of that history. So one of the things that he said that he was going to do, there's a Route 66 and American in I forget the exact title of it, but it's created by Lisa Snell Hicks, who is a Cherokee journalist who actually you get the perspective of what tribes territories you're traveling as you pass Route 66 and the actual Native museums and Native owned businesses that you can visit along that route. And he said that he was going to make that available as well in Oklahoma as I believe there are 11 tribal nations that Route 66 passes through in Oklahoma, and that is such a wealth of information to be had. And so I think that was one super positive thing. There was another woman who was a part of the workshops who also works in tourism, and she said that the conversations at the park really helped reframe how she thinks about tourism and how to kind of consider these very romantic notions of what the past was. And that is romantic for I don't want to say just white people, but it was a lot easier for white people to participate in these realities that you are now celebrating without kind of including other people's experience and understanding that that was not the same experience across the board is negating so many people. And it's continuing with the same kind of the same things that were happening then. Exclusion, racism, it's just done in a very quiet way. I wouldn't say always, because we still have, public lynchings.
Some particularly loud, but it's in some ways a little more insidious because it's subtle, and so
it's made invisible
and very easy to close your eyes and cover your ears and say that's not happening here. And then,
yeah. And I think there was definitely. I know that Reese was very, I mean, he's always been really helpful in kind of providing information for me if I needed, you know, a connection with something. And so I know that he like is present and is participating. I think that so much needs to be done, and a lot of signage. Signage is like, it's important, but it is just the first step.
Yeah.
There's so many more ways of engaging the public that are so much more interesting. And I think that's why artists should take the step to kind of bridging the gap, because you can be a commissioner or a director or somebody very passionate about something. But if I think to do it well, you have to have a creative mind to think about how to engage in like a different modality. And
well, art's all about communicating, right? It's all about taking what's happening in here and what your engagement with everything outside of you and creating something that, like, what's the word, like makes it real, like puts it to paper, puts it to a piece, and communicates your experience with this moment and this feeling, and takes it out there. And I think, yeah, in order to really fulfill the missions of these different organizations, you have to have a creative mindset, or be working with people who have creative mindsets, because they're the people that are going to take that mission and turn it into something tangible. And that's what's going to, like, your community engagement with this tangible object is what is going to ultimately fulfill the mission and the vision of these organizations. So,
yeah, and I think it's across the board. I mean, there's like I come from like a background of social practice. And so, from that background of thinking about socially engaged art, it's like, maybe there's not a ton of examples in Oklahoma, but there are a ton of examples of artists who are partnered with the, like, what's the agency that does all of the waste and sewage in New York City? There's this artist, Muriel Letterman Euclides, who was an artist in residence for 30 years with the sanitation department. And she did a number of different, like, activations with the garbage collectors of New York City to kind of make visible how important that role is in our communal life of living in a city together. And I mean, that is another invisibility, essentially. It's like, well, you don't want to like see or smell the waste, and thank God there is somebody collecting it, because if there wasn't, we would have a real problem on our hands. And, I think that like, it doesn't matter what organization. I think bridging kind of this like cross-disciplinary conversation will only be good no matter what, for any agency, for any. And I think also there's like a little bit of that kind of impetus in this book, is like putting people together who don't cross paths, like historians, curators, activists, artists, politicians who, maybe are thinking in totally different lines of inquiry, but really, I think curating that conversation is super interesting.
is this, so shifting more into the personal, is this a project at scale or that you've done before, or?
I would say that, I mean, first of all, this is my first book, and that was a feat. Like, that was a huge thing.
Truly is.
Yeah. And so no, I haven't done anything to this scale before. I will say that like my practice in general has been from a very collaborative place. And in Oklahoma, I'm like based in Brooklyn, but I spend a lot of time in Oklahoma, and and in other communities. And I think like the work that I was doing when I was a younger artist in Oklahoma was very collaborative at its essence. It was like engaging the dance community and the music community, and like, like creating kind of these like multi-sensory performances or experiences. So in that sense, yes, that is kind of like the lineage that I kind of come from. Participatory, like really like bringing together a lot of different voices, creatives, whatever. So, and I think that, yeah, as I look back at a lot of even the like work that I do in my own studio, because I feel like I have both a public practice as well as a studio practice, but my studio work is very similar. It's like bringing together conversations that then become a visual output for the conversation. So
It's awesome. Is that something that you think you'd want to return to? Something that's, both like a very practical piece and then like engaging in this like research and public discourse surrounding the art?
Are you saying something similar to like a public park or monument or something like that, or what are you specifically thinking?
But I'm just thinking about like all of these pieces together. Like you were engaged in the work of actually restoring the park, but then you were also clearly doing research and engaging with the public and these events at the park and these lectures, and then doing the work of putting together this book. Is that something that you think that you'd want to do again, like engage in this very public and highly documented art experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like that is kind of like what, I mean, I think that the form of a book is a really good way for me to kind of like tie things together, because in a lot of my like practice, there are already essays that tie, like research together. Yeah. And, I think the like more immediate projects that I am thinking about are much in the same vein. There's like a research project that I initiated that is based on oil country in Oklahoma, and talking to a geologist and an oilman and a historian, and really kind of like having this conversation with people whose worlds kind of may intersect slightly, but also don't at all. And I'm really interested in this idea that like, well, everybody participates in space in a different way. And so how do you like make visual all of those other ways of thinking and perceiving space that are your community? So there's like a sculpture and a kind of wall installation that's up right now at Pursuit Films that kind of is the initiation of that research made visible. But it's kind of, it's asking as well to be a site for a conversation, to like actually, hold a public conversation around like, well, what's the history of allotment? What's the history of oil? What's the history of the actual, like, I shouldn't say history, but what is the geology that we're standing on? Mm-hmm. There's another residency that I have in St. Louis that's kind of from the same impetus at the Luminary Arts, which is an impetus to have a walk, as the starting place for the conversation, and having each different thinker or academic or artist or whatever engage with that same walk and show what they're seeing. And so it's kind of like becoming a repository for making visible like all of the different ways that we collectively participate in the same space. So I think like, yes, in short, yes, as like an artist who's interested in placemaking, I think having and holding a space for different voices is super important. That it's not just like, I don't necessarily feel like my voice is the most important voice in the book. It's the one who's like framing the conversation, but it's like who is a part of the conversation that is important.
And it feels very not just because it's largely transcripts of conversations, but the every piece of it feels very much like you're sitting down having a conversation about the product and about the process and about Oklahoma history. And so I think that you have very successfully communicated like that vision here. And I can see how that would transcribe well elsewhere. I want to shift even more personally. Just kind of walked through like your journey as an artist. So like, when did you feel like, ah, yes, I am an artist and I'm going to be an artist?
Yeah, it happened when I was 15, and I was like very artistic, but it wasn't until somebody put an oil paint in my hand and had me translate a watercolor that I had done into oil paint. And I was like, oh, I'm a very clearly a painter. Like now I know exactly who I am and there are no questions. And throughout like my, educational history, I tried to like be a physicist and an archaeologist and all of these other things where, at the end of the day, I was like constantly just like pulled back into being an artist because I just feel like that is truly who I am. And what's really amazing is that you can kind of pretend to be other things while you're an artist. So
not unlike being a librarian. You just like get to try on other hats.
Exactly. You get to really delve into like so many different like knowledge bases. And so the evolution of my like art making has been like fully oil painting into I am a very kind of transient soul as well, and having an oil painting studio is a very it's like a fire you have to tend constantly. So I stopped painting for a long time and started doing large scale sculptures out of ephemeral materials like newspaper as I think it happened when I was traveling in Southeast Asia, and it was like the two materials that I could find no matter where I was newspaper and chicken wire. And like that became like the medium that I was using because it was accessible and, I think a low impact on the environment. It was easy to source. It was cheap. It was either cheap or found materials. And so that kind of large scale public sculpture, I started working with a lot of dancers and musicians as well to kind of do performances, and that kind of took a different turn when I went to grad school. I went to grad school for social practice, and so it was a much more kind of it was like the program that I went to is very like art activism, in the political world as well, thinking about what and how the arts can contribute or how you can, communicate certain things or how you can even make art with a group of people. And so this is like a book and it was a public program, but that I consider to be like my art practice as well.
Yeah.
Because the whole thing was bringing together a group of people and really creating like, a monument in itself from this like archival impulse.
Mhm. I love that. I'm going to kind of wrap it with this question that I ask everybody on here. You're a very unique guest in that you're not really coming from like the literature community. And so I'm excited to hear um, through this process, and particularly in assembling this book, what is something that has really surprised you or you found particularly interesting? It's the stumper.
I think that what was really amazing was to be able to all of a sudden, instead of thinking about research as a very solitary endeavor, that my research was public in the sense that it came from other people's research, it came from conversation. It was like all of these conversations that led me to find so many different things that I didn't know about. So that I was leading the inquiry, but I was not like that other people led me to the research.
Yeah.
I think one of the most surprising things is how long it takes to get like photo rights for images. And once I was like in, I was like, well, I'm already this far in. I might as well like really go in. I think there are 195 images in this book, and it's like so many of them are sourced from so many different historical societies all across the United States. So that was a really surprising endeavor for me, for sure.
What I expected when Stuart reached out to us about Totem, but when we received it, I was like, it's so much more visual than I anticipated, and not a single photo is wasted or superfluous. It's all so important in telling the story. That just
Thank you.
I appreciate. Thank you for putting this together.
Yeah, I mean, I think like one of the things that as a visual artist, like I wanted it to be such a beautiful kind of like every single spread was thought about. And I was very lucky to work with Ryan McGann, who was the designer of the book, who like really cared to make it beautiful on every single spread. And I will say, like, I hope that you and anybody who's listening can come to the exhibition, because essentially what the exhibition is it's like the evolution of this idea, but it's really thinking about what the archive is and what ephemera is. Yeah. It kind of like digs into this idea of the ephemera, which is essentially the central thesis of the book, that, these sculptures were made by photographs and things that Ed Galloway would have seen in like the 20s and 30s that informed what he was building. And so the exhibition comes from that place of like really examining the ephemera of the era, and also all of the ephemera that really kind of like is the research of the project, of the park, and also of like contemporary thinkers and artists who are present in the show, and what their inspiration was, and how that has kind of, it's like the idea of like, what is your inspiration and what do you pull from, and so we've essentially made that visual in the exhibition.
It's really like something with a wide engagement in it's an entire piece in and of itself, from the park to the book to the exhibition. Just very cool.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing maybe that I want to just add is, this idea of like it kind of being, yes, based on the Ed Galloway Totem Pole Park, but it's actually more about methodology and how anybody can think about using this format or, like method of complicating space, of really like digging into history and like making visible a lot of the invisibilities. And so kind of the all of the ways that the art has kind of spilled out into the public, whether it be the exhibition or, you know, the billboard or, you know, these other kind of conversations that are being held, is doing that. It's like showing, oh, they're like, this can, you know, this is a format that can then translate to any place. You know, it becomes something that, yeah, it's a way of making visible histories in any community, and really kind of like offering space for community to be their own archive, essentially.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And Totem as Monument and Archive by Erin Turner is available at Meadow Market Books. It's also available through This Land Press. So definitely grab it, engage with the, I guess.
Yeah, through August
Give
1st.
folks, you know, a solid 2 months
Beautiful.
to make their way down there and check it out. So,
Beautiful.
well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Paper Girl podcast. We will with you later.